Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. I hope it's hot enough for you outside and cold enough for you inside. I'm Steve Morrison, Senior Vice President here at CSIS. I direct our Global Health Policy Center work. Thank you all for coming today. And welcome to those who are joining us online. Special thanks to Lily Dattilo and Joe Jordan for helping to organize this event, and to Janet Fleischman and Katie Peck for their work on adolescent girls, young women, and HIV, and the two new publications that we've published that are copies are available, hard copies available today and copies online. We'd also like to acknowledge that the Malawian ambassador to the U.S., Ambassador Edward Savarangera. Ambassador, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's terrific to have you here with Violet from the embassy. And we're especially honored to have Ambassador Virginia Palmer and Ambassador Deborah Birx here today. They are true champions for adolescent girls and young women. We've heard about Virginia's leadership quite a bit from Janet and from Katie Peck, and we're very grateful to all of the hosting that you provided to our team when they were there recently. It was really invaluable in connecting our folks to a range of activists, women activists in particular, in Malawi that you've galvanized. As many of you know, the CSIS Task Force on Women's and Family Health launched its report in March, focused on a bold vision to unlock the potential of adolescent girls and young women in select low-income countries. We argued that adolescent girls and young women are a pillar of long-term economic growth and opportunity, with benefits to them and to Americans. We called for building upon the PEPFAR structures, especially DREAMS, which is a very significant public-private partnership focused on preventing HIV in girls and young women in 10 countries, and really it's been pioneered with relentless determination by Ambassador Birx and her team. The task force recommendations are vividly illustrated by the discussion of DREAMS that we'll be having here today. We said that the formula for success would require high-level U.S. diplomatic engagement and empowering U.S. ambassadors to drive implementation and create new partnerships through the in-country mission there. And Ambassador Palmer is proof to that point. U.S. leadership is essential to the vision of the task force and to the world's ability to prevent HIV among adolescent girls and young women who face such high risk of infection in East and Southern Africa. We have not given up, as you'll see today. We've not given up the quest to move forward this agenda that was laid out in that task force report. That task force ran for 18 months from October of 15 through this March. It involved ultimately 7 members of Congress and another 20 very diverse, very prominent opinion leaders. I urge you to go and read that report if you haven't yet. It's a very powerful, heavily documented, and very well-argued piece of work. Janet was terribly integral to that work from start to finish, and we're very grateful to her for the leadership she's shown in carrying forward our work in this area. So over to you, Janet. Thank you so much. This is a terrific gathering. And Travis, what do we need? All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Steve, for all your leadership on these issues and the support for the agenda on adolescent girls and young women for all these years. I also want to acknowledge the Adolescent Girls, Young Women Working Group that we had here at CSIS as part of our HIV/AIDS working group. Their engagement and their insights have been invaluable as we move forward with both the reports that you have today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Katie Peck, who was with us at CSIS for 3 years but has moved on, and her engagement on the work on adolescent girls and young women through the research and the travel and the writing was quite instrumental. I traveled to Malawi in April to better understand the implementation opportunities and challenges of DREAMS. When I went to the Machinga district, one of the areas where DREAMS is operating, I saw firsthand the challenges that girls and young women face, the way the social and economic vulnerabilities expose them to HIV and other health risks. Teenage girls and young women who drop out of school, often related to early pregnancy, early marriage, or the ravages of extreme poverty, have few options to confront the high level of HIV risk that they face. Yet many of these young women want to get an education. They want to find employment. They want to pursue a different path than what is largely available to girls in their communities. One of these young women was named Chipoloro, who became actually a Dreams ambassador in Malawi. And she told me her story. She was an orphan, unable to get a spot at secondary school. Although she had passed the exam, there just weren't enough spots in the secondary school. And at the age of 15, she got pregnant. Her grandparents chased her out of her home, and she was left in a very difficult situation. When her child turned 3, she decided she wanted to go back to school. And with the support of one of the mothers' groups in her community, she passed the exam for secondary school and was selected and won a spot in one of the schools. So now she's back at school. She encourages other girls in the community to go back to school. She goes to girls' clubs, which are safe spaces where girls can discuss the challenges and the issues that they face and the importance of protecting themselves against HIV. Her story and so many others in Malawi exemplified the success of PEPFAR. Over the last 14 years, new HIV infections have declined by 34% in Malawi. Despite being one of the poorest countries in the world, Malawi is approaching its treatment targets, and the possibility of reaching epidemic control is within reach. But Malawi also lays bare the gender and demographic challenges that face the HIV response. Adolescent girls and young women are up to 8 times more likely to be HIV positive than their male peers. This is fueled by the stark social and economic realities they face: low secondary school completion rates, high rates of adolescent pregnancy, gender-based violence, and child marriage. We'll hear later a bit more about the youth bulge in Malawi and how the demographic realities facing the country demand a broader, more comprehensive response for a country where nearly half the population is under 15. So while Dreams has helped galvanize attention and resources in Malawi, its success remains uncertain. Failure to effectively reach this growing population of young women and their male partners jeopardizes over a decade's worth of US investments and the prospects of reaching epidemic control. So this is an extraordinary moment. PEPFAR has driven remarkable progress in curbing the epidemic, but this success masks area of urgent, unfinished business that could derail the momentum, and preventing HIV in adolescent girls and young women is chief among them. So today we are honored to have Ambassador Palmer and Ambassador Birx here. As many of you know, they are 2 of the most extraordinary champions for adolescent girls and young women and HIV, and to find new approaches that the US can engage with host governments, civil society, and other donors to try to find new ways to curb incidence in this population. So we want to get through some of the key challenges and questions, and that includes: how do you show impact in a short period of time on issues that are notoriously difficult to turn in a short period of time? And how do you take these lessons and share them more widely and show that a more comprehensive approach can have impact? How do you engage with strong host country commitments and leadership so that these programs can be sustainable over the long term and ensure that the US ambassadors and US country teams are fully on board? How do you transform the growing global interest in women and girls in a range of sectors into effective HIV programming to highlight the results? And importantly here, how do you maintain the strong US leadership and bipartisan support, build public-private partnerships, and galvanize momentum with other donors, other bilateral donors and multilateral donors, as well as national governments? And ultimately, what is the cost of failure? So we are honored to have Ambassador Birx and Ambassador Palmer here. You have their bios in front of you. Ambassador Birx is going to start out with an overview of DREAMS and the current results. As you know, she is the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and the Special Representative for Global Health Diplomacy. You have her full bio in front of you. Ambassador Palmer is the U.S. Ambassador to Malawi and a member of the Senior Foreign Service. Previously, she was in Pretoria and has extensive experience in both Africa, Asia, and other parts of the State Department. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Birx, and then we will have a chance to have a moderated question and answer period, and then to hear from all of you. So thank you. Ambassador Birx.
Great. Thank you. Oh, good afternoon, and I just want to start by really, should I turn this off? Is that better for you now? Nope, okay. To really thank many of you who have given of your time to DREAMS over the last 3 years, often without pay, giving us your best advice, and hopefully you see yourself in the program. Let me make sure. Okay. So why focus on adolescent girls and young women? And I think it was so well laid out by Janet. I'm not going to repeat it, but if you're an epidemiologist or you're following an epidemic and you have a rising number of individuals at risk, because of a population bulge, even if you have a significant decline in the rate of new infections, you're going to have ever increasing number of new infections despite an improvement in your HIV incidence. So this, it's stark in every single country in sub-Saharan Africa. This year in Uganda, the median age is 15. It will be down to 14 in just the next 2 years. People talk about the youth bulge, and it truly is a bulge in Namibia, Botswana, Swaziland, and South Africa, and Zimbabwe, but it is a youth wave that is unrelenting and projected out to 2050. These are both young women and young men. So although we're talking about young women today, they grow up to infect their peers in the 20-year-old age range. And so we are concerned about both young women and young men. This is the youth bulge. It has surpassed India, or the youth wave surpassed India and China. And you can see it's unrelenting. That dotted line is on a logarithmic scale slope now, and it's continuing to escalate out to 2050. I think you can see from the beginning of the epidemic, which is that first rectangle, to where we are now, we've exactly doubled the number of 15 to 24-year-olds. We also know that the lives of young girls are particularly complicated, both from their communities, their families, their relationship to others. And so part of the whole epidemic was to really understand the cycle. This is work done by Koresha and Slim Corinne, really showing us clearly that young women are infected by older men in the 5 to 8-year-old age range, who then the young women who become positive don't know their serostatus. The young men don't know their serostatus either. The 25-year-old men are completely unaware that they're HIV positive. It's not that anyone is intentionally infecting anyone else. These young men are healthy, and they have no reason to interact with the health system, and we haven't particularly told them to interact with the health system. And so they infect young women who grow up and then infect their peers, and that cycle continues unrelenting. So although we're talking about DREAMS today, we've been very careful to have very strong young men's program. It's very funny because we started our young men's program in 2009 with voluntary medical male circumcision and really aggressive prevention messaging. And at that time, no one asked us what we were doing for young women. But as soon as we launched DREAMS, everybody came and said, what are you doing for young men? So that still shows us how we are a bit prejudiced still in our thinking and in our programming, because I promise you, in years of presenting voluntary medical male circumcision slides and our progress, no one asked me about our progress in young women. We've been doing surveys in the fields, and we're triangulating program data, and this has been very important to us, because it clearly shows our success, but importantly, it shows our failures. And I think what we've tried to be is very honest with where we're succeeding and where we're failing. And clearly, this is the orange represents undiagnosed individuals at the community level. And you can see that less than 50% know their serostatus if they're under 25. And so what are we doing specifically to address it? And we have programming specifically going on that. This is Malawi. Since we'll be talking about Malawi, this is their community-based survey. The lighter turquoise lines are young women. And so you can see how quickly prevalence starts to escalate. And you can see how low the prevalence is, under 3%, leading up to 15 and 20, and then it explodes. And so in this case, prevalence is really a marker of the acceleration of incidence and new infections in young women. You can see the men lag more than a decade behind. And so it really allows us to very clearly articulate who's at risk, when they're at risk, and ensure that we have prevention programming to ensure that that risk is decreased. This is the youth bulge in Malawi. This is the beginning of the epidemic. The scales are the same. Just look at how much bigger the bars are and how big the bars are all the way down. What does it say? It says Malawi has done a remarkable job in improving under 5 survival. And so this is the consequences of improving under 5 survival. They grow up and become teenagers. I think we didn't realize that when the numbers came out from Millennium Development Goals and we said we improved under 5 survival in sub-Saharan Africa by 75%, none of us said, oh my gosh, and now they're going to be 15 and susceptible to other diseases. So as discussed by Janet, anywhere between 5 to 14 times higher risk of HIV infection. And one of those core drivers of the risk, and this is the number of girls, and I mean girls, whose first sexual experience is rape. And so dealing with this issue at the same time we're working with communities and families and education, all of these issues have to be comprehensively addressed. And this shows that ongoing sexual violence, this is unwanted sexual violence in the last 12 months that these young women are experiencing, and it's close to 40% in most countries. We know that girls are the first often to not be given spots in school. We know that every government has the ability, when all the girls and boys pass, to figure out other reasons why they just don't qualify to make it into secondary school. And I think this has to do with the fact that space is limited, and there's only so many desks and seats, because when that under 5 survival started improving, none of us planned to have 2x the number of desks and teachers and classrooms. We also know that education is extraordinarily important. A study that was done in Botswana, and you know all the data from cash transfers and keeping girls in school, the dramatic impact that it has on the rate of HIV infection. And so knowing we have so many more young women at risk, and less than half of them in school, and really understanding what we can do. So we think the solution lies within DREAMS, because DREAMS, based on all of your advice, is comprehensive. It's looking at structural issues rather than biomedical issues, although there is some prep for most at-risk young women. But it's really looking at the family, the community, and the adolescent and young girl herself, putting her at the center and saying, how are we working in all of those different ways to ensure that the young woman remains HIV negative? Because we know if she's negative, there's a whole set of structural issues that have been addressed, and that she won't have teen pregnancy and she won't have child marriage if she also remains HIV negative. We've incorporated the DREAMS components. That was a central initiative for those of you who follow all of the intricacies of how PEPFAR puts out its money. It is now part of the country operational plan. Why is that important? For the reason you heard about, how important our ambassadors and the team on the ground are. So the ambassador is responsible for the entire implementation of the country operational plan, and thus the DREAMS component. We also, based on the early successes that we were beginning to see just in girls that were reached and the qualitative stories that were coming back, we expanded DREAMS to 5 additional countries, Namibia, Botswana, Rwanda, Haiti, and Cote d'Ivoire, to really see whether we could have that preventive upfront impact, particularly in 9 to 14-year-olds. And we have hired 2 experts to come and work with us, one working on 9 to 14-year-old girls and one working on young boys and men, and simultaneous trying to really evaluate every program that we have to see if they're having the impact that we need them to have. I knew there'd be some people in the audience that wanted to look at numbers and budgets. Just to be very clear, that Excel spreadsheet is there for your whenever you would like to look at it, because now they have the slides. About 200 million went out new this year for the DREAMS program, making that program in the first 3 years over $500 million just for girls. And I just want to spend this second to thank our private sector partners. We are where we are today because of Girl Effect, Johnson & Johnson, Bill and Melinda Gates, Gilead, and V, who brought their expertise to us. I never knew anything about market segmentation and message segmentation until I talked to our private sector partners who understood how messages had to be relevant. For those of any of you who have raised children in the last 2 decades will understand there were some children who did talk on the phone, then there were some children who would talk on a cell phone, and then there are these children now who will do nothing but text you, even though they only may be 2 years apart in age. So market segmentation is actually key if you want to learn how to communicate effectively with your adolescents and young women. This is the last slide. It's a slide from UNAIDS, which I think really captures the moment of where we are, and it's the lead-in to Ambassador Palmer. This is the success of Malawi. And I think we all applaud the amazing vision that Malawi had to go out there with B+. That was saying to the world, any HIV pregnant mother, we want to thrive and be a mother and healthy, and we want her baby protected, not only during pregnancy, but also breastfeeding. It was so forward-leaning, it took the WHO 2 years to catch up with them and make that recommendation. And you can see how effective their amazing program has been in preventing pediatric infection, and they're very close to achieving the goals for 2020. You can see the success that they've had in finding children who are HIV positive and getting them on effective therapy. But in that middle, we are at that big circle that's got to go to that little teeny tiny circle in order for us to be successful in our goals for preventing new infections in young women. So we know where we've been and we know where we're going, and thanks to you all, I think we are really accelerating to a new place. And I just want to really end again by thanking you for your constant feedback, and more importantly, for your constant dedication to these issues that are affecting young women so that we can be better at programming, and I really appreciate everything you've done. So, do I just introduce Ambassador Palmer?
Thanks, Ambassador Birx. I love to hear Ambassador Birx talk, and I always want to work harder on these issues and maybe go to medical school, though I think it's a little late for that. I've been in Malawi for 2.5 years now, so I have to do some protocolling. I would please like to protocol Ambassador Swearingen, who's Malawi's ambassador to the United States. And Carol O'Connell, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, and my boss is also here, so I'm glad you're here. I'll give you my 3 bottom lines up front. There's no other country than Malawi, I think, in the world, but certainly in Africa, that has the trifecta of being as small as Malawi is, as poor as Malawi is. Malawi is arguably the poorest country in the world. You don't want to win that contest, but $370 a year per capita income, and as friendly as Malawi is. So we can try development concepts, we can try bold things in Malawi, we can try integrated approaches and prove to the rest of Africa and the rest of the world that they work. It's a wonderful place to work. My second bottom line is that adolescent girls and young women are the fulcrum of all of our development goals, especially our prevention of HIV and getting ahead of the cycle of the epidemic. And then the third thing is that unless we empower adolescent girls and young women with a combination of interventions, education, health, and community interventions, we can't break the life cycle of the HIV epidemic and achieve our 90-90-90 goals. So I want to set the scene for Malawi a little bit, and talk to you about the relationship and about Malawi's economy. Malawi is an excellent partner of the United States. They participate in UN peacekeeping operations. They have a perfect record of no bad behavior to civilian populations. They led the world, as Ambassador Birx said, in the implementation of Option B+, and showed the world that it could be done that way. They vote with us pretty consistently on key votes in the UN, and they're influential in the AU and SADC. So it's an important relationship for the United States. Malawi is a democratic country. and has a military that protects civilian rule. So it's a strong and democratic partner. But its poverty is crushing. And I didn't understand for the first 6 months I was in Malawi what that meant. 70% of Malawians live below the international poverty line of $1.90 a day. 85% of Malawians are dependent on rain-fed agriculture. And that dependence on the weather meant that last year, for example, with the El Nino drought, 40%, 6.7 million Malawians were food insecure. And the United States spent between 120 and 140 million dollars in humanitarian assistance last year in Malawi. Ambassador Birx and Janet have talked about the population bulge. Half the population in Malawi is under 15. And the population doubled between 1990 and 2016. And what that means is that any investment that a donor puts in or that the government of Malawi puts in is very quickly overwhelmed. If you build a classroom, it's full immediately of 5-year-olds. And they can't keep ahead of that curve. In health, it means that Malawi has 2 doctors per 100,000 people. The number in the United States is 175. There are 3 pediatric surgeons in Malawi for a population of 17 million people. 37% now, because of interventions that people have made, of Malawian children are stunted. And that has long-term impacts on other development outcomes like education and productivity. The average class size of a Malawian school is 105. In some places, that's up to 200, can you imagine, in the United States. And Malawi has a generalized severe HIV epidemic. The prevalence rate has gone down pretty markedly, as Ambassador Birx already showed us. At the height of the epidemic, 30% of pregnant women were HIV positive. Now the generalized prevalence rate is about 10%. So we've had a lot of success, but getting to that final point where there are fewer infections than is hard, and adolescent girls and young women are at the center of that. The poverty is particularly telling for women. Malawi ranks 173 out of 188 on the UN's Gender Inequality Index. There are some cultural practices in some communities in Malawi that are really harmful to children. In Malawi, fewer than 20% of girls who complete primary schooling enter secondary school. They drop out for various reasons: huge amounts of domestic chores at home, long distances they have to travel to school, insecurity on the way to school. They don't have power. 10% of the population has access to power. So if you don't get things done in daylight, you're not going to be able to study at night. This means that they're dropping out of school, often in early grades, but certainly between the 8th and the 9th grade. It means they're having children earlier, their sexual debut is early, and it means over the long run that they'll make poorer decisions for their families. I'm going to circle back on this, because it means that women, for example, lots of women can't add in their heads. So they say, well, if I go to market, I'll get ripped off, because they will get ripped off. And that means they're not going to marketplace, that they're not exposed to new agricultural technology, for example. So though they're doing most of the farming work, they're not necessarily bringing in new techniques or new technologies. So it inhibits a lot of other goals that we have. As Ambassador Birx mentioned, that Malawi has the 11th highest rate of child marriage in the world, and 30% of 18-year-old girls are either pregnant or mothers. That sort of early childbearing has all kinds of health consequences, including obstetric fistulas and HIV. Gender-based violence is pervasive. According to CDC's research, 1 in 5 women who had sex before they were 18 report that it was violent. And 1 in 7 Malawians, girls and boys, report that they have been sexually abused. Most importantly, and Ambassador Birx mentioned this already, for our discussion today, adolescent girls now comprise almost a third of HIV infections in Malawi. And incidence of HIV for adolescent girls and young women is 8 times higher than for their peers. This has lifetime implications for our other development goals, and so therefore I think adolescent girls and young women are at the fulcrum of all of our development goals. Our agricultural goals, our population growth goals, our economic development goals are all influenced by the success and health and education of adolescent girls and young women. And most particularly because we cannot interrupt the life cycle of the HIV virus, where older men are giving the virus to adolescent girls and young women who, as the virus matures and they mature, then give it to boys their own age, unless we do something about adolescent girls and young women. So DREAMS was the response, and I I salute you for that sort of inspiration. And in Malawi, we have, as Ambassador Birx already mentioned, a very layered approach where we do teacher training to help teachers help girls be more successful in school. We work with mothers groups who go door to door and bring girls back to school and encourage girls to stay in school so that communities understand the value of girl-child education and don't, when there's hunger like there was last year, keep the boys in school but pull the girls out. We have mobile clinics that get health services close to schools and make sure that those services are youth-friendly. So the nurse doesn't say, what are you doing here? Does your mother know you're having sex? Which deters kids from seeking family planning or advice and education about HIV. We're also building WASH facilities so that girls don't skip school because they're menstruating and then fail because they've been absent so much. So there are a lot of interventions that are happening in a holistic way, and that's very important. And Ambassador Birx brought a delegation to Malawi in December, which was the head of the Global Fund, the head of the Global Partnership for Education, Gavi, and the head of Girls Not Brides, and the ambassador at large for women's issues from the State Department, because they wanted to look, they never traveled together, that group, but they wanted to look at the holistic approach to girls and see how doing all of these things together had markedly more impact than doing them separately. And that trip, I think, was also a good example of how diplomacy and programmatic things can be mutually reinforcing, because Ambassador Birx and the delegation met with President Mutharika, and President Mutharika at that meeting established an Adolescent Girls and Young Women Task Force, which is interministerial, and that task force at the end of this month will produce Africa's first Adolescent Girls and Young Women strategy, which is holistic and multi-ministerial. So once again, Malawi is going to lead the way. And we are trying to get back behind that Adolescent Girls and Young Women strategy and recognizing that AGYW are at the center of all of our other development goals. The mission director for USAID is our point person for Adolescent Girls and Young Women. And he and I have started an Adolescent Girls and Young Women donor working group so that we can leverage what the EU and DFID and Norway in particular, but also the Global Fund, are doing for Adolescent Girls and Young Women, so that each of us are doing things where we have a comparative advantage, but so that our programs are mutually reinforcing and not duplicating. There's a huge scope for public-private partnership in this area. I think Girls Not Brides network has already convened their 60 partner organizations in Malawi. The Global Partnership for Education has offered to pay for a coordinator for the AGYW strategy, and Gavi provides important entree into schools and health centers. But education is going to be the key. And right now, 22,000 girls a year pass the primary school leaving exam, but then don't continue on to high school because there are not sufficient places for them. There are not classrooms and teachers available for them to go to high school. And if there were sufficient classrooms and places, there would be another 120,000 girls who could proceed. You wouldn't need that exam as a filter to progress onto the 9th grade. We don't have a filter in the United States. You just finish the 8th grade and go to the 9th grade. And so that's very, very important, I think. And Ambassador Birx called me in October of 2015 and said, we got dreams is scaling up. What can we do that is bold and decisive that would really make an impact? And so we went scurrying around and got all the data about where the highest incidence of dropouts were. And in fact, the word dropout is sometimes inappropriate. These girls are pushed out of school because there are not places for them. So the highest rates of pushing out and then the highest rates of HIV, and then looked at what we could do that would have the boldest impact on the epidemic and on the empowerment of adolescent girls and young women. And it was to build prefabricated classrooms. So Congress willing, we will spend $90 million over the next 5 years, which will be completely transformational, I believe. And we've gotten commitments from the government of Malawi to train and pay for teachers in each of those classrooms. And we'll memorialize this in an MOU. I'm still working on the MOU, and I have not talked to the president yet about tuition waivers. Ambassador, you could give him a heads up for me. But things like comprehensive sex education and youth-friendly health services being in close proximity to the school are things that I know that the ministers involved would welcome, and that we hope we can bring into the formula because we're leveraging a major U.S. investment in these great things. We're going to couple this with a very comprehensive monitoring and evaluation system, and I know Janet's made some very good points about looking separately at each of the interventions to see which is most effective. But we're going to do a lot of work with recency studies to see when adolescent girls and young women are infected, and to measure what we hope is the outcome of this BOLD project, which is reduced HIV infection rate, higher retention in school, and lower pregnancies and later marriage. And again, the government of Malawi is behind us on this. The government of Malawi already spends 27% of its budget on education. And the president just assented to a constitutional amendment that raised the age of majority to 18, and that makes it easier to implement the Marriage Act, which makes it illegal to get married before you're 18. So there's a lot of progress. I hope that Malawi will become an example for the rest of Africa and the world, that Malawi will be able to demonstrate to the Kenyans and Tanzanians that, hey, look, I kept my girls in secondary school, and it had this impact on the HIV epidemic and this impact on public health. And over the long term, I saved X millions of dollars in ART treatment. And I have greater productivity, and my women are participating more in the economy. So all of our development goals will be assisted by this particular bold and important intervention. And again, it's a good place to try it, because we can try it in Malawi because the government is so welcoming and because Malawi is small, so we can do it for a relatively small investment. I think the impact of this worldwide could be huge. There's evidence from the International Center for Research on Women that suggests that child marriage alone will cost the global economy over $4 trillion between now and 2030. They say in Malawi it results in a loss of productivity of $167 million. And we're going to break the cycle that locks women and their children into a cycle of HIV and poverty. So I love to talk about this, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you both so much. You can all see why we're so honored to have these two ambassadors here with us today, because it's hard to find two other better champions who can speak with the kind of passion and insights that these two powerful women have done for us. And we have lots of questions still, because this is a very complicated project, and certainly risky in certain ways, because things are being done differently. So to begin with, Ambassador Birx, can you describe to us how this is different? What we talk about layering and saturation for dreams, what does that mean, and how is this a departure for the way PEPFAR has worked in the past?
So I think in three different ways. One, this was done from the ground level up. So we had our first meeting, I think it was now, oh gosh, I guess almost 3 years ago, where it was a kickoff meeting in Johannesburg, and we really had teams come in and we presented the evidence base that was in the literature. We took everything that has shown any impact on HIV prevalence in young women and presented all of that to the teams. And we let the teams pick whether they did, and it was all age segmented. So this is best for 10 to 14-year-olds. This is what's had an impact from 15 to 19-year-olds. And every team picked their combination. So some teams, I know Kenya is one of them, is doing like all 8 things in all age groups. And other teams are doing less in pieces and parts. And so we'll be able to combine the data in a matrix way to really get some implications for what things have worked better than others, but we really wanted this to be planned at the grassroots level and implemented at the grassroots level. I think shockingly to us now, we also asked for all the teams to have focus groups with young women. Now, that seems shocking now, but at that time it was, what do you mean you were going to plan to do this for adolescent girls and you weren't going to speak to them? Well, we weren't, because we sometimes don't. So we did. and really listened in their focus groups to what their biggest concerns are, what were their barriers to success. They know what success looks like. They have seen other women and young girls succeed, and they know where they are, and they know what those barriers were. And so that's what developed the wheel of how much work goes at community, how much work goes into the family and parenting, and how much work is going into the young girl itself. And I think we've done everything that they've asked for, except they were the ones that continued to ask us for more young boys programs. So, and I know now why they did that, because Girl Effect went into Malawi, and the young girls had an insight that we didn't see. They knew that young boys only saw them as a sexual object. And they know because of that they were only seeing themselves as sexual objects. So there was no sense of friendship, even at 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds, between young boys and young girls. And I think they sensed that and knew that was an issue. I think Girl Effect has really shown us that that's an issue. So I think in every way it's working differently. And these teams, because it was so different, it did take almost a year to get to full implementation, and not, I would say just in the last 6 months, all countries now, of the first 10 countries, are at full implementation. But those of you who know me know that I am fairly deficient in patience. So I was like, what do you mean we're not fully implementing yet? It just took a while in some cases. And I think having the term DREAMS, I did not come up with DREAMS. Determined, resilient, empowered, AIDS-free, mentored, and safe. We knew that we needed to do many things for a young girl, but our team came up with DREAMS, and I think it captured where we're going as a group, and I think Swaziland has taken this to countrywide. South Africa has taken it to countrywide, and we believe that young girls seeing themselves in that brand of dreams and a different future for themselves, they will drive us to create that for them. So that's how it's really quite different.
When I was in Malawi, I was fortunate to be able to be meeting with Ambassador Palmer the day that she was hosting a fabulous woman party. And I was lucky enough to get invited. And it was business leaders and civil society leaders and young women and government officials and other international women who were engaged in different projects in Malawi. What has driven you to be so focused on the importance of engaging with women and girls in the country where you are the ambassador?
You know, as a female ambassador, I was a little hesitant to make women's issues the sort of the key point, but I really have come around to think that it is the fulcrum, the sort of the point on the seesaw upon which all the other development goals depend. And that if we can empower those women, we will make agricultural markets more effective. We'll get better education outcomes. Women will have smaller, smarter, healthier families. And the economy will prosper, as we hope it will, because it's such a great partner. So I think it has to do with the fact that it's the right thing to do. And as a benefit, it also helps us achieve our development and foreign policy goals in Malawi.
And could you speak for a minute about how the food insecurity and the drought had a particular impact on women and girls in Malawi, and the link to HIV that you saw?
Well, we did some creative things, I think, in response to the hunger crisis in Malawi last year. We put in additional school feeding programs with take-home packages for girls and orphan boys. And we made sure, thanks to PEPFAR, that we could give prescriptions for food to people on ARTs, because the medicine doesn't work and makes you sick, in fact, if you're hungry. So we were able to protect some of the development gains that had been made that we were afraid would be rolled back by hunger. We didn't want to see girls in particular, but kids of any kind pulled out of school because their families couldn't afford school fees, or because they weren't well enough to go to school. So we used USAID programs and PEPFAR programs creatively, I think, to mitigate against the effects of the hunger crisis.
Ambassador Birx, you spoke about the voluntary medical male circumcision and the programs for addressing men and boys, and it's proved to be very challenging. Can you give us a quick sketch of what is the situation for men and boys, and how do the programs targeting that population align with the work you're doing on DREAMS?
Yeah, that's a great question. We knew from our violence against children surveys that CDC had been doing in the field and PEPFAR has been funding for the last 5 years, that both young boys and young girls were affected by sexual violence at very early ages. And so we could see that, and then we could see the legal framework that existed in many countries to mitigate against that. But then we could see at the community level, it had become, that level of sexual violence had become normative. Aunts, mothers, grandparents had all experienced it. So the other shocking thing to us was both boys and girls, about 65% report sexual violence to a friend or a parent, but less than 10% are taken to any services or anything in the future having. So less than 2% get any services. So we knew that we had to deal with this in a comprehensive way. I think voluntary medical male circumcision and young boys programs has been particularly difficult because they don't see themselves in the health sphere. Young girls and women often see themselves in the health sphere because the one place where health is consistent in many resource-limited settings is around children and pregnant women. So children and pregnant women, and particularly women, are responsible for the health of their family, and so they have been engaged in this way. So believe it or not, we started to talk to young men and men of all ages. And we learned a lot we didn't want to hear, I want to be honest, because a lot of it said that they didn't want to go to female physicians or female nurses because we talk about them. I told them we did not find them that interesting, but they still believed we were talking about them. So we've got really, because we have such incredible US ambassadors on the ground, they go back then and work with the ministers of health. There are male nurses and male physicians available throughout all of our countries, and now they're focusing them in after-hour clinics, 4 to 8 in the evening and on the weekends, to really meet the time needs that young men have. And I think we have to do that same thing for young women, because non-pregnant young women also don't have time to lose their entire day to interact with the health center. And so really finding flexible hours, weekend hours, has really changed our ability to deal with young men and boys. We still don't have the magic formula for young boys, and that's why we have hired experts in the field to come and help us, just like with the DREAMS program, to really come in and tell us how we do age segmentation and develop messaging that's appropriate for both young boys and men, and establish a sense of wellness, a sense of wanting to interact in a positive way with the health centers. I was talking just this morning about someone who was very interested in global health security, and I'm like, in global health security, you always focus on the bricks and mortars in the laboratory, and you forget sometimes that if the community does not have a relationship with the health center, and if the clinicians don't trust the laboratory, you're going to have a breakdown in your whole global health security endeavor. And I think we're really learning that because we're on the forefront of interactions with the health centers and the communities.
Could I chime in on one thing too? I think the implementation of Test and Start has a huge effect on that. Because you used to say to people, oh, come in and get an HIV test, and then go away and only come back and get medicine when you're really sick and your quality of life has diminished. And now in Malawi, they say, come, you'll get treatment that afternoon that will save your life and protect the people you love. And that's a whole different sort of invitation then than it was previously.
It's interesting because in Malawi, DREAMS is focusing largely on 2 districts with the hope of expanding. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit about what that vision is? It's been huge investment of resources. There are other donors like the Global Fund that is providing catalytic funding. There are the other donors that you mentioned that are interested in other pieces of this. How do you see this going forward so that you could reach some scale?
Well, I do think PEPFAR is the leader, but we've done a good job of coordinating with the Global Fund in particular that has DREAMS-like programs, and I say DREAMS-like meaning holistic programs that address community and health and education. And when we talk about this education intervention, we're talking nationwide. Blantyre is not a DREAMS country, but the HIV infection rate in Blantyre, which is Malawi's second city, is 18%, so much higher than the national rate. So we need to focus on areas where the HIV infection rate is very, very high. But you particularly with these interventions for young people, need to make sure that you're hitting nationwide.
One of the big challenges, of course, is how do you measure and monitor all this? And Ambassador Birx, you spoke about bringing in experts and trying to think about this in a new way. It's always complicated to do a multi-sectoral, more comprehensive program, and we don't have a lot of evidence from the past on that because there haven't been the investments in those programs. Why is it so important to do it this way, and how do you measure it?
So the reason we started with a limited number of districts in the 10 Dreams countries is because we didn't want the resources to be sprinkled everywhere. We wanted them concentrated so that we could say, if you do these 3 things, they're critical to the life of a young girl. And I can't tell you what those 3 or 4 things are yet. We are really pleased that Bill and Melinda Gates has been part of this project from the beginning, because I always think it's very important to have an outside group looking at you and telling you, not good, good, not good, this happened, that happened, and that's been really super helpful. And one of their key partners is Population Council, who's been feeding us back information. Just as the very simplest thing, this was supposed to be comprehensive and multi-layered, and in our first analysis, about 20% of the girls were only receiving 1 intervention. So, we had the meeting, we said, okay, that's like missing the mark, because remember, it was supposed to be comprehensive. And we found that if you're over 20, it's very difficult to get more than 1 intervention, because you don't have all of that time in your life to go to girls' clubs or go to these other pieces. And so we've had to really modify how we work in different age groups to really meet those needs. And I think we believe, and hopefully you will all stay tuned to the International AIDS Society meeting that kicks off in Paris this weekend, because there will be a seminal announcement of our next survey from Swaziland, and I think you will see some very great data. Of course, I can't talk about it because it's all embargoed, but I think it will give us additional evidence of the impact that we're having. And of course, we're doing recency assays, looking at first pregnancy rates of prevalence and also incident infections. And we're certainly using these surveys to give us a great idea of what's changing in young women. I do believe that when we finish this set of surveys, which is in about 13 countries, we will go back and repeat the surveys, enriching for under 35s to really get very precise incidence and prevalence in young men and young women, to really understand those numbers completely and understand if we're having an impact on their risk and their risk behavior and therefore their incidence. And it will have information about gender-based violence and childhood marriage and other indicators. But we're excited about where we've come from, but we're also excited about what we're going to be doing over the next 4 years to really look at these issues in more detail.
Ambassador Palmer, you had mentioned the importance of access to the mobile clinics and the other broader reproductive health and family planning services. Why is that important, and what are the challenges in Malawi? Because it's, when we were able to see the mobile clinics, they have to be a certain distance away from the schools, and yet there were floods of young women who were afraid to go to the regular clinic and could go to these mobile clinics to get HIV testing, to get information and services on family planning, and they clearly, it was addressing a huge need. Can you talk about what you see in terms of the importance of those programs?
Well, I mean, there's physical distance, and having to walk 20 kilometers to a clinic is a deterrent for anybody, particularly somebody who's not sick, making the hike and taking the time. I think the government is welcoming of the mobile clinics and having them not on school grounds, but right next to school grounds, so that's not a problem. But I think it's a matter of training the clinicians and the testers and the nurses there to not sort of be finger shaking at the kids, but to be welcoming. It's like in America. If you thought somebody was going to tell your mother and you lived in a village, it would be a deterrent. So I think just making the information sort of digestible for an adolescent, boy or girl, and making the clinical staff understand that there are real health reasons for reaching out to those people to prevent the epidemic, then I think we'll all be winners. But I think it's a welcome initiative. I don't think they're not policy impediments to it. It's a resource issue of how many mobile clinics can we have.
And how can you strengthen the regular health system to be more adolescent friendly?
Right.
so that you don't have to have the mobile clinics, which is an issue not just in Malawi, but in so many places. You had told me when I was there, when we were speaking about economic empowerment as a piece of this, that you had actually invited Ivanka Trump to come to Malawi because knowing her interest in economic empowerment and all the interesting issues that were happening in Malawi. Can you explain to us why you invited her and why that piece of economic empowerment is so integral to all these issues?
Well, I want people to come to Malawi. People who come to Malawi, and I particularly want the new administration to come to Malawi. People who come to Malawi get a crush on Malawi. And it's a nice place to see the impact of this development work because it's friendly and it's democratic and poor. And we're making a difference. It's the kind of place where the United States can make a difference. Ivanka Trump was a founding partner of Girl Up. And Girl Up is the sponsor of YSI, Women in Science, STEAM camp, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, that's going to bring girls from 5 countries and the United States to Malawi. So I was hoping she would attend, and she's booked up. But I do think that the things that we're doing and the difference that it's making are things that I'm proud to show off to people.
Ambassador Birx, what are the big challenges to keeping this on the US agenda and the global agenda at a time of constrained budgets, all kinds of other challenges? What do you see as the most important ways to keep this moving forward?
Well, I think you could see in the United States, I mean, no one really has a grasp of HIV/AIDS any longer in the school systems, I mean, in the high schools. It's a sentence in some health textbook. An interpretation of that sentence into your potential risk is never done anymore. And this is starting to happen in sub-Saharan Africa. I meet young girls in the Durban area who say to me, oh yeah, no, I know all about, so they have information. Information does not become knowledge, and knowledge that results in them making a personal assessment of risk. And so when you say to them, yes, they know that HIV is out there, but that's over there with those people, I never see it. And then you say to them, well, how many sexual partners have you had? And they say 3, and I say, wow, that's about a 75% chance that you've been exposed. They are just shocked. I mean, it's just a shocking moment to them. So I think it's teaching us that both here in the US, people get complacent to the same message. And you have to constantly be asking yourself, is that relevant, and is the platform we're using to convey that message relevant? Do we have something on Snapchat and Instagram? Do we have something on Facebook for sub-Saharan Africa where people can get legitimate information that's truthful and related to them? Do we have enough peer-to-peer discussions and peer-to-peer outreach? Do we have enough young women willing to talk about being HIV positive and the impact that it's had on their skin, their hair, their dating? This becomes very real to a 19-year-old. Mm-hmm. If someone says, yeah, you don't want this because my medication's making my hair brittle and my face dry, and by the way, it's really hard for me to tell my sexual partners and my boyfriends that I'm positive, and the last time I did, I got beaten up. So, I mean, it becomes much more of a real message, but I worry every day about getting enough ahead of the epidemic that when the same complacency that is developed in the US comes to sub-Saharan Africa because people aren't dying anymore, that we will be so far ahead of the epidemic that we won't have this rate of infection any longer. But I think you asked a really critical question. How do you make these diseases that are pandemics real and interpretable, and how do you can change your message to keep up with the new ways of thinking? You know, we're nerdy scientists that aren't used to trying to have messages that are relevant and completely change, but you realize how important that is when you try to explain your program to a 19-year-old who's like, yeah, I read that in a book, it's not relevant to me. And they're in an area where 40% of girls by 20 are HIV positive. So, I mean, it's really we have to figure out how to do a better job. And I just want to applaud again the women's groups and the private sector who's really helping us do this, because they know how to do it. I was just so impressed by Girl Effects when they came from the Nike Foundation, because Michael Jordan was our hero. I'm old. The fact that there are people still buying Air Jordans means that they've learned how to sell it to the next generation and the generation after that. That's what we need. We need someone who knows how to change messaging over time to still attract people and make their product relevant and something that people want to act on. So we're excited, but we're also always cautious.
May I chime in too from a U.S. perspective? That's also the sort of the receptors of the message, but I think for the people funding it, as I've worked on PEPFAR over the years, I have really internalized the idea that it's a national security issue for the United States. That people in the United States could get HIV in ways that we're never going to get malaria, happily. You can get HIV, and the security of the United States is affected if the epidemic gets out of control again and all the policemen and soldiers and teachers, or generations of people, die. Then societies of our partners and our adversaries are negatively affected. So we need to stay committed to this for national security reasons.
Thank you. I could keep going on and asking questions, but we have a room full of people who are very knowledgeable. So I'd like to open this up to Q&A with the audience. What we're going to do, we have some of our colleagues are going to walk around with microphones. We'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions together. Please identify yourself and keep it to 1 question, please. And hopefully we can get a couple of rounds in. So questions from the audience? Okay, we have one over here.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Matheson. I have a question about what you mentioned about changing the Marriage Act to age of majority greater than 18. How is that going to affect ethically the distribution of information down to lower age levels, where will they have to have consent from parents and the issues that raises, and I'm just wondering how it's going to be handled.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple. Was another question up front here? Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for doing this. This is Daniel Renches from Feature Story News. So with regard to the budget, the big elephant in the room, is there a sense then that your arguments are getting through about the need to continue at least at the same levels, if not, ramp up? And secondly, how does it split out? Because you're talking a lot about education and the social infrastructure and the need to continue to have that. But that's also presumably part of other budgets that are also vulnerable. So I don't know what the question is, but that's the that's the sense. I just want to get your expertise on that, basically.
We'll take one more from
here. Hi, I'm Constancia Mavodza. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I've just started working with the Center for Health and Gender Equity. And I had a question. For most of the DREAMS countries, they're also facing human resource for health shortages. And has there been any links between that shortage and sort of your impact when all these young girls have to visit facilities at any point? And are there strategies to sort of curb that shortage and how it might affect the success of DREAMS?
Thank you. So we'll take one more from this side, over the woman with her hand up with the blue shirt. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jordan Haley. So with Trump's new proposed budget to decrease funds towards programs in family planning, how do you think that affects what you're trying to do in preventing HIV in adolescent girls and young women?
Okay, thank you. We have 4 questions. One on the age of consent and marriage, the budget questions on PEPFAR and beyond PEPFAR, the human resources for health, and the family planning. So why don't we start with you, Ambassador Birx?
Great. So I'm going to let you take the age of majority and how that applies to, and I hear, Bonnie, your other questions are about, I'm sure behind that is also about clinical research and access to cutting edge research and clinical trials. So on the budget and impact on programming, so I think We have two pieces of the budget, and I think we have to separate administration, policy, and endorsement of the program, which we clearly see from both the President Trump himself as well as our secretaries. Secretary Tillerson, very active, engaged when you've seen his briefings and his Hill briefings and how engaged he's been and how knowledgeable he's been on PEPFAR, as well as Secretary Price in ensuring that one of his first trips were to Africa and looking at global health programming in the field. And so I think there's absolutely comprehensive support for our global health programs. And of course, then we also have Congress, who's also been very supportive in a bipartisan way. And I think we always talk about the money that Congress appropriates, but I think what Congress knows about the program and asks for reports about the program also drives us. And I think we shouldn't forget that having staffers and senators and congressmen and women who are interested in the program is another set of eyes that's really driving us to different programming and asking different questions. They go out to the field, they often see the programs, and they come back with very specific insights and questions that are really helpful to us. Because when you're so immersed in your program, sometimes you can't, even with all the data that we're utilizing, we still bring our perceptions, and having an outside look into the program is really key. And so I think between the depth of the administration's commitment plus congressional bipartisan support for these global health programs, I really don't have deep concerns of our futures. I think the other thing that it's our job to make our programs more effective. And I think and no one wants to talk about this, but the fact that we've increased treatment by 50% in the last 3 years in a flat budget, this isn't a miracle. This says that we had a lot of inefficiencies and ineffectiveness, and we just have to be honest about that and fix them. And I think we're using data to find that and fix them. And I tell you, we just had a great partner meeting with headquarter partners, and they were thrilled to show us their innovation and their cost decreasing methodology that's resulted in increased quality and lower cost, and really pushing the envelope in a lot of these pieces. And so I know we like to talk about budget, but I really like to talk about how much we've been able to do within our budget and how much more we can do if we really continue to look for those kinds of inefficiencies that we have and we know all program has. I love the question about HRH shortages, because we have an agreement with our historic black colleges and universities, and you never know what you're going to, we're talking about one topic, and then one of the professors says, oh, and I have this program that we do in the United States, and in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, we train young women to be community health workers, and then they immediately move into the clinic, and I'm like, oh, that's what we need. Can you bring it to Africa right away? So they're talking to Malawi, because that would solve a lot of our issues. We would have young women trained, we would have them in school, they would immediately be able to become very productive members of the community as community health workers. We would strengthen the health delivery system and provide really a long-term impact. So there's a lot of amazing things being done. It worries me every day what we're missing, not what we know, but what we're missing, because she just was casually, oh yeah, it's been going on. We've had this program in the inner cities of the United States for 3 or 4 years. It's really going well. And I'm like, that's what we should be talking about, because that's what we need. And we recognize that there's still a community, human resources for health issue, but I just have to go back to Malawi with their 2 physicians, and I'm not sure how many nurses per 100,000.
28.
That didn't keep them from succeeding. Now, it may not be pretty all the time, but they didn't say, oh, I can't do B+ and save pregnant women and young babies because I only got 2 of this and 28 of that per 100,000. They figured out a way to make it work, and I think, yes, we want it to be better every day, but we also have to applaud countries who have figured out with what they have to make it work while we work forward to making it better. And I think, a lot of people like to look at the obstacles that are ahead of them and say they can't. We like to look at places like Malawi and say that's what PEPFAR and our ambassadors make happen. They take the impossible and make it possible. And we just send out these memos and say, this is our expectation, and then they just do it. So it's been a very, very exciting piece. And then family planning, we have not seen specific cuts to family planning and programming, so maybe you could talk about that.
I think the whole government has Mexico City rules in the back of their mind always. So in Malawi, it hasn't had any impact on programs yet. There's a sub-partner that we might not be able to work with, but it's a sub-grantee. And otherwise, it's been fine. On HRH, I'll chime in too. Health gap gives us a lot of pressure, and Ambassador Birx demanded the data from us about how Malawi is the poster child for providing treatment, in particular, for much less than almost anywhere else in the world. But we're kind of at the limit of where that can be done. And you don't want to walk through the TB clinic with your newborn on your back to go get an HIV test. So we did a lot of measurement of what treatment space was available and what clinicians were available, and we presented that to Ambassador Birx, and in COP 16, she gave us $9 million for health infrastructure. So that included some HRH and some sort of physical prefab pharmacies in a box and prefab ART or testing units. And then we've been very careful to make sure that the people that we train are bonded to a PEPFAR-funded facility, so that we know that we're not just sort of training people that go off to other programs or to the United States, that they're working in PEPFAR programs. On the age of majority, what happened was the Marriage Act was passed in 2015, and then people were afraid that they wouldn't be able to implement it, so they wouldn't be able to prosecute somebody or annul a marriage of a kid who was 13, because the Constitution said that marriage was legal at 16. So they've changed the legal age to 18. I haven't heard any blowback for things like clinical testing. People just rejoiced that it would make it possible to do things like Chief Kachindamoto has annulled 2,000 marriages and sent those boys and girls, because there are a lot of boys involved in those child marriages too, back to school. And so there's not going to be a potential court challenge to the very generally progressive change in the Marriage Act. And then, the question about the budget, everybody's waiting to see. I'm waiting, with bated breath. I know that, for example, school construction, we don't have any money for anything like that. So this PEPFAR money was bold and completely new. But that it was the responsibility of the country team to make sure that it didn't duplicate things, or didn't duplicate things that the EU might be able to do, or the government of Malawi could do more cheaply. So we have worked that out, and we've made sure that our programs are properly integrated through the country strategy, CSP process it's called. And there are programs that are funded by other agencies or through USAID or CDC that will benefit the PEPFAR programs. There have been some surprising changes. It used to be that PEPFAR was the only biggest, fattest dog, and everybody would raid them. And now Ambassador Birx kind of put a stop to that. And so now, in fact, it's working the other way, where some of the other programs, I think, are benefiting PEPFAR. And that's the way it should be. It's our responsibility as public servants to make sure that the taxpayers' money is well spent and not duplicative and mutually reinforcing.
So we have time for just a couple more questions. Let's see. Why don't we go right here? We'll have the first question here. And we'll try to run through three really quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks very much for your inspiring words. I'm Elizabeth Gardner from AVAC, and I'm interested to hear if there's any movement to introduce oral PrEP. Lots of great innovations on prevention, but wondering if the lessons from oral PrEP introductions from other countries are coming to Malawi any day soon.
And in the middle, right here.
Hello, my name is Faiza Ali. I volunteered in Somalia and worked with the population to eradicate FGM. And I found that women's health is very much shameful in the society. So my question was, what challenges did you have in the Malawian community to kind of change their attitudes on child marriages, and also HIV treatment.
And one last one will go right there, the gentleman right there.
Thank you. Carl Hent from American International Health Alliance. I want to thank both the ambassadors for inspiring remarks today about Malawi and speaking about the HBCU Global Health Initiative, which has kicked off in Zambia. Very exciting. Now you've got us excited. Can we come to Malawi?
So why don't we run through these questions, and then I'm going to give you a chance to have any closing remarks.
Okay, thanks. Sort of in terms of changing mindsets, that's a really key question, particularly when you talk about harmful cultural practices. So here's an example of we're using other monies to benefit PEPFAR programming. We got some money because Malawi is a gender-based violence focal country, so we got some money from the State Department for gender-based violence. And it's enough money to be able to engage faith leaders and traditional authorities who are very important in Malawi on gender-based violence, which is a little bit like motherhood and apple pie. But those people are real thought changers, and some of them are very progressive and some of them are not. So I think getting them to address AGYW issues and gender-based violence in particular will be very important. And thought can be changed. The president is a he for she champion, so speaks very boldly about women's issues. That's very important. And then the previous president, President Banda, declared that all women should give birth in a clinic, basically, which had an enormous impact on infant and maternal mortality. And then the chiefs have come in behind that with bylaws that say, if you don't give birth in a clinic, I'm going to fine you a chicken or a goat. And the chiefs are now doing the same thing with child marriage, which is fantastic because going to court is like a big ordeal and it's hard to do. But the chief can shame you and make you pay. So getting those thought leaders is really very important. And I'm happy that we have some programmatic money to be able to bring them together and sort of inspire them to be forward-leaning about those things. And on PrEP, with Ambassador Birx, pressure from Ambassador Birx, we have been leaning on the Minister of Health, who seems amenable to doing PrEP for key populations. There's a resistance in some resource deficient places to say, well, I've got sick people who are not on treatment. Why should I put people who are not yet sick on treatment? And so we've engaged in the conversation about how it's cost-saving and preventative, and you're going to save people over the long run and save money. And they seem open to doing it and piloting it anyway.
Great. I don't have anything to add. That was
Could you speak maybe a little more broadly about the PrEP and how that fits into DREAMS?
So in this last cycle of the country operational plans, almost all of the 10 original DREAMS countries are providing PrEP in some way, whether it's a pilot, planning for a pilot, or in a more comprehensive way. Some of the countries have already moved from highly restricted, high-risk, key population, young women pilots to a broader pilot, really looking at 20 to 24-year-old young women and really seeing and finding an algorithm for really risk assessment. It's very difficult. Obviously, not every young woman can go on PrEP. There's not enough financing for that. So really finding out what is particularly putting young women at risk. And then, of course, we've mapped the epidemic and the program down to the site level. So we have a very granular view of the epidemic so that we understand where the higher transmission areas are and where we need to be more aggressive in our prevention.
So I'm going to give you each just a minute or so to give us any closing remarks or anything that we didn't ask you about that you think people should be aware of. And I can remind you that I should have welcomed our online audience. We have lots of people watching online, including many in Malawi. So we welcome you. We wish you could take your questions as well. But this gives you a chance to just wrap up with any closing thoughts.
Great. So I think we really are in a moment in time, and I know people say that all the time, but when you see this youth wave and you see the risk to young women, if in this moment we don't figure this out and really get these programs to stale, we are not going to have the impact on the epidemic we were hoping to have. And we know that's both young men and young women because we know young women are becoming infected from men in the 25 to 35 who don't know their diagnosis. And it really is this huge cascade of wellness and health and how you get people engaged in their personal wellness, and what does that look like? And that's a concept that has not been highly effective in the developed world, and it's a concept that we are working very hard on in the developing world. And if we get this right, it's not only going to end the epidemic, but it will position every single country to be able to address any NCD that they want to address in the future and any global health security issues. So we believe that we're at the fulcrum, just like young women are at the fulcrum of ensuring that we move forward to development issues. We believe the next 4 years in PEPFAR will determine whether we control this pandemic, and through that are able to provide the systems that can really address NCDs and global health security in the future.
Pastor Palmer?
And I think with Malawi sort of as a case study, and hopefully a model, we can show how a country which is a good and willing partner, but who can't do some of these things without U.S. assistance, can do bold, groundbreaking things that can change the way Africa and the rest of the world thinks about the epidemic and what we need to do to fight it. And the fact that doing these things has a positive and transformational impact on all of our development and foreign policy goals is an enormous benefit. And so I want to I'm grateful for your support and the support of the American taxpayers for doing those things, because I do think that it will be able to show a marked difference with these programs.
Well, this has been a great opportunity to hear from both of you, and once again to tell you how extraordinary it is to watch the kind of work that you've been doing at the global level, at the country level, to try to make the case for the critical importance of moving forward with these programs. And it's amazing to think our first report on dreams was, I think, launched in April 2015. Ambassador Birx, you were here for that. We are so grateful for the vision that you've provided and the willingness to come speak to people in the community who are interested in moving these issues forward as well. Ambassador Palmer, for you to take time when you're just dashing through Washington, because I think giving a little glimpse of what is happening on the ground and why a chief of mission would be spending her time, in part, weaving these issues into the rest of her agenda. And I think that's a really important lesson for other ambassadors in other countries, and one of the important ways that these issues are going to get the kind of traction through the U.S. policy mechanisms. I hope that we will have more opportunities to hear from both of you and from others on the ground who are involved in DREAMS implementation, the voices of the girls and the young women who are themselves a part of this program and whose future is what this is really all about, linked to the broader effort to have PEPFAR succeed and to ensure that U.S. policy is focused on these issues in the most robust and evidence-based and data-driven way. There's lots more work to be done. We thank all of you for the work you've done and will continue to do. I want to signal that we are going to do a quick podcast with Ambassador Palmer. If those of you who haven't yet subscribed to the Take As Directed podcast, please do. Ambassador Birx has already been one of our guests and spoke a lot about this very issue of adolescent girls and young women. And we've had lots of other very interesting interviews, and we encourage you all to subscribe. And because Ambassador Birx is heading off to the airport and we're going to do this quick podcast, I'm going to wrap it up here. And thank you all again. And please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much.